Well, hello and welcome to Zero to Angular in 45 minutes. This is Craig Shoemaker, and thanks for joining me today. Now, as you can see at the bottom of the slide here, I've added my Twitter handle. So if you have any questions that you want to have answered or continue the discussion about this presentation once it's over, please feel free to contact me up on Twitter. So let's go ahead and get started. This slide here is probably the most important one of the entire presentation. And this shows you where you can get access to all the code that I'll be showing you today. So just go to github.com/Craig Shoemaker Angular 2 intro. You can download, clone, fork, send pull requests, whatever you want to do, and have full access to interact with the code that I'm showing you. So we're talking about Angular 2. And the nice thing about Angular 2 is that it is now in release candidate. So what that means for you is that all that I'm showing you today, while it may not be 100% the same upon the release, chances are most of what you see here will all be the same. As far as the APIs, they've really solidified. There may be some breaking changes, but certainly all of the concepts that you're learning here today will all be the same. And probably most of the syntax and APIs will be locked down for the release. So release candidate is a good place to be in. So before we go any further, let me show you the application that we'll be building throughout our time together today. So this is a movies app, and what you can do is take a look at the list of movies that come through. These are just some of my favorite films that I put in here. And there's a few things we can do. Number one, we can filter, not only on title, but also on genre. So let's say that I want to look for all of the movies with an X in the name. So we've got The Matrix, and so I made an axe murder, or everything with the, it would just be The Matrix, or everything with AN or AM. So A Few Good Men and Good Will Hunting. So on top of being able to filter, you can also click each one in order to select it. And that puts out the title here up in this selected area. And beyond just the title, you can also do it based off the genre. So you'll notice down here, I have the genre for each one. So if we just wanted to look at all the dramas, it will filter on that as well. So there's not much to this app, granted, but it actually covers a lot of the main concepts that you need to understand in order to be familiar with Angular 2. And so we'll go ahead and dig into this. So let's talk about what Angular is. And it's a single page application framework. And when I say that, I mean, there's much more to it than just data binding or just an MVC implementation. And so if you haven't had any experience with Angular 1, there's quite a bit available to you. So we're talking about components and data binding. The style isolation is really helpful. There's routing, testing support. I'll show you how the dependency injection works. There's also a whole implementation for observables and animation, and really so much more. So what you're getting is a solid foundation for you to use in order to build your applications on top of. And some people even go so far as to say that Angular is really a platform, not even just a framework. And so it really kind of speaks to the sense of the fact that there's so much here for you to draw upon in order to build your applications. All right, well, let's turn our attention back to that sample application. And what I'd like to do is deconstruct it for you a little bit so that as we get into the code, you'll kind of know where all of the pieces fit together. So this application is built off of a single component, and this is the movies list component. Now, the purpose of the movies list component is to list out the movies and provide a way to collaborate the interaction between the input that comes in, whether it's a click on a card in order to select one, or typing in some text into the filter box in order to filter out the data. So the movies list component kind of contains everything together and allows that interaction to work between the different aspects of the application. Now, if we take a look at the filtering, we'll implement a pipe. And so this is the pipe filter component. Now, the pipe filter itself has really nothing to do with the UI element. This is just what I have outlined to kind of make the point. But the whole idea behind the pipe is that what you can do is build something that is able to transform the data that you pass to it. And that's in its own container. It's in its own component, which you can then use in other contexts beyond just what we're using here. So the pipe will work to change the data that comes in and out of it. Next is the movie card component. So all of the style information, the markup, and all of the logic that's responsible for making this movie card is all encapsulated into a single component. Now, as we get into this, I'll show you how style isolation works so that any of the style rules that I've applied to this movie card are all set to work only within the context of this component. So I won't get styles applied that bleed out into other aspects of the application. And so that's something that's really helpful when you're trying to build self-contained components. Next is the movie's service component. Now, what we want to be able to do is access data in a way that it's not built directly into specific components. So we want to be able to use dependency injection in order to access a service that's responsible for going out and getting the data and providing it into the main component. And so that will be done through the movie's service component. Now, the language of the day is TypeScript. Now, you can build Angular 2 applications using other languages. Dart is one of them. But TypeScript is really the language that's the prevailing one right now because, number one, you have a strongly typed environment to work with, and it transpiles down into JavaScript and gives you the opportunity to run all of your applications in the browser. So if you're not familiar with TypeScript and you haven't had a chance to dig into it yet, what I'd like to do is give you a quick primer on a basic component here within TypeScript. So just like you might be used to doing in other types of languages like maybe C or C#, VB.NET, Java, anytime that you want to use, say, a class or some sort of resource, the first thing that you need to do is import it into your current context. So the first line here imports the component from the Angular core. And so we'll use this component in order to set up the actual class that we're building for the component that we're building. So you'll notice that the first thing we'll see here is this @ sign. And so what this is actually a decorator function. So when we call @ component and open and close parentheses, because again, it is a function, and then provide some data into it, what we're doing is decorating a TypeScript class so that Angular knows how to use it within its pipeline. Now you'll notice here they have a selector, and the selector is my-app. What this selector does is essentially declares our own custom HTML element. Now this sidesteps any sort of DOM manipulation that we might have to do, because what's happening is it'll create that custom element, and then as Angular is working to initialize and boot up this component, it will look for an element called my-app and inject the HTML that's defined for this component into that element. And so when it comes to the HTML that will be injected, we have here the template. And so we have this h1 of hello world, and that is what will be used in order to build up the contents of this component that we're building. And so to round things off, we have to export something out of the module here. So we'll export the class of app component. And once all of that gets wired together, we're able to use it in an HTML page. Now that HTML page, here's a little sample of it. It's just any regular HTML page. And so you see we have a body, and then we encounter our custom element here, my-app. Now, what I can do is I can add some information here that shows up as the application is loading. So here I just have an H1 that shows the loading message. It could be an animated GIF, or it could be, maybe a game or anything that you want. So you can provide some information that shows on the screen as things are getting booted up. But then as that component begins to process, it'll look for an element within the HTML file called my-app, and they'll load everything into that element. So that when you run the page, it looks like this, hello world. All right, well, that's the basic introduction to a basic component. So now let's go ahead and dive into the code itself. So let me get this set up first here. We're gonna start off at this point. Now let's take a look at the HTML page here. You'll notice that we're starting off with a single HTML page. And of course, that's what you would expect because this is a single page application. And so as we come down to load in the scripts and begin to get everything set up, you'll notice here that there are a number of scripts set up as polyfills for older browsers. Now, as you look at the Angular Quick Start, you'll see that these are the items that they list. And in fact, they even need to be in this order in order to support your older browsers. So make sure the polyfills are there. And then the next thing that we'll do is get everything set up in order to get the actual application itself running. So what you might notice here is the fact that there's not a list of tens of different scripts loaded onto the page like you might be used to seeing with Angular 1. And that's because we're using the system.js loader. Now, if you read the Angular documentation, they're quick to point out that system.js is not the only option. It's not even the prescribed option. It just happens to be the option that they choose to use within the documentation, and that's why I'm using it here. But system.js is set up in order to load in all of the different modules that we create, and as they reference each other, it will load them in as necessary. So the way it works is we call system.import, and we're importing the app, which is our basic app, which I just called app. And then if there's a problem here, it'll log that out to the console. But in all the configuration information is set up over here in system.js.config.js. So you'll notice here that the app is being set up. And so this maps it basically to what folder it's going to look for all the files. So we have app up here. And then down in packages, it says app is set up to start off with main.js. And also the default extension is JS. And that's helpful to us because as we reference different components, we don't have to give a file extension. So this is saying that as the application gets set up, it will go to main.js. And so we can come up here and look inside of main.ts. Now, of course, main.ts will eventually be transpiled into JavaScript since this is our TypeScript file. So this is where we want to look in order to find the logic of how the application will boot up. So starting at the top here, you'll notice that the first thing that we're doing is importing Bootstrap, which is a function that's available through Angular Platform Browser Dynamic. Now, this is really interesting because Angular is set up to be cross-platform development ability. So you can build an Angular 2 application that works native within a mobile application. You can build an Angular 2 application that works strictly on the server, and you can obviously do one that works within the browser as a single page application. So here what I'm telling the application to do is boot up this app as a browser application, and when it boots up, what I want it to do is run this app component. So when we look at app components, this should look very familiar to you. This is the same code that was on the slide that I showed you. So this is great and this all works well, but the first problem that we encounter here is templates. What we don't want to do is have all of our HTML that we're building for the application inside of a variable inside of quotes. It's just very difficult to manage. So really what we want to be able to do is to allow this component to work with an HTML file. So you'll notice here I have the stub set up for the page itself. So I've got the movie's title there in a Jumbotron. And what we want to do is add that custom HTML element here into this file. So let me switch branches real quick. And this is how we want it to look. What we'd like to do is add in movies-list and create that new custom element that we want the application to work with. So once we have this element available, then we can go back and take a look at the component and see how it will interface with this element. So when we go back into the component, when I change branches, I'm updating the code, and I'm doing that instead of having to type code in front of you. So you'll notice as things change along the way. So within app component, what's different now is what we're doing is accessing the template URL here to say that we want the HTML template that's associated with this component to come from this HTML page. And so this gives us full ability to work with HTML in ways that we normally would within the IDE by having it within its own file. Then within the component, we set template URL, and this path here is relative to the actual HTML page that it's running in. So from index.html, we're going up to the app folder and then looking for app component.html. And so that's why you'll have those paths for anything that's a property of the component. So anytime you define a URL in the metadata for a component, you always want it to be relative to the HTML file itself. Now, the next new addition that I have here is this movies list component. And so what we've done is created a component that is singly responsible for showing the movies list. And that's available up in movies-list. So let's go up and take a look at that. Let's start off by taking a look at the TypeScript. So here's the component. And just like you saw on the demo, here's the data that I have available. And right now this is being set up as an array of any type of JavaScript array. So that will allow the movies property to be able to return the values that's here. So this is how we do properties within TypeScript. I don't have to prefix it with anything. I just give it a name, I give it a type, and then give it a value. Now, what I want to also be able to do is to tell my view whether or not I have movies available. And this is valuable because if there's no movies being returned, I'd like to show something different than if I do have data to show. So I create this method here called hasMovies. Now within TypeScript, I don't need to have the word function in there in order to create the function or method in this case, since this is a class. So I can simply give it a name, open and close parentheses, since there's no arguments to pass into it, and give it a data type. And in this case, it's Boolean. So in the same way that we did with the last component, I've given it a selector. In this case, it's movies-list. And then I have the template URL for app, movies, and then movies-list component HTML, which routes right up to here. So that once I'm working with app component and I have this movies list element here, I can add that in as a directive, and then my app component itself knows to bring that in as a directive by adding it here into the component decorator function. So this is an array here that tells the component what other components are available to be used within the component. So this is setting up a parent-child type relationship. So the definition is here, and then the markup is up in the HTML file. Now, remember, like I said, I wanted to have that function that was available to say whether or not I had movies available. So we'll use that here. Now here you get the first hint of something different with the directives that are found within Angular 2. So let's come down here and look at this one here where there's no movies to display. So this directive starts off with an asterisk, and that's done on purpose in order to give you a hint that the directive that you're using here edits or manipulates the DOM in some way. So here, the way ngIf works is that if the expression that you give for its value evaluates to true, then it will add those items to the DOM, and if it evaluates to false, then it removes whatever it's attached to from the DOM. So here, if hasMovies returns false, and then we switch that with the exclamation point, then it'll show this message saying there's no movies to display. On the flip side, if there are movies, then ngIf will evaluate to true, and then we'll be able to add in these elements into the page. So as we go down here, you can see another item. So we have the asterisk here for ng4, again, giving you a hint that some DOM manipulation is happening. And we're using the ECMAScript 2015 or ES6, whatever you like better, syntax for creating variables. So here it says let movie of movies, and this maps to the property within the component that we created. And this is basically the for each loop that runs through and creates the elements for each one of the data items. So we'll create a class, and then inside that we'll create an image, and on down the line. Now, as you notice in here, what we're encountering is two different ways in order to do data binding. So there is the string interpolation type of method here, you can see with the double curly braces. And then there's also using the square brackets, what is called property binding. So each basically do the same thing. With string interpolation, it's taking the value from the data item that's coming in, which comes in scope from the declaration here. So we take a look at the current movie and add in the image URL. And I have to use string interpolation here because I don't want just the raw data itself. Instead, what I want to be able to do is concatenate it together with image / in order to create the actual path to the image. So here I use the double curly braces in order to run string interpolation for binding this way. Alternatively, what you can do is what's called property binding. And here we see a different kind of syntax within HTML for Angular 2 as well. The best way to think of this is that when you're thinking about regular JavaScript, there is the bracket notation that you can use in order to either access the value outside of a JavaScript object, or if you want to assign something, you can do object and then square bracket, you give the key of the property that you want to use and either assign that value or pull it out. This is done in much the same way. So what we're doing is saying that there's a property of this input, or excuse me, of this HTML element that we want to assign the value to, and that's the alt tag. And what we want to do is add it to, or give it the value of movie.name. So this is property binding, and this is how you do one-way binding within Angular 2. So then I can continue to fill out the card by creating a header and giving a movie.name using string interpolation, and the same thing with genre. So if we take a look at what this looks like at this point, you can see that we have the movies listed out on the page. And it doesn't look all that pretty yet, but it gives us the data displaying on the page. And that's all done through the ng4. All right, so that puts us in a good spot, but we have a little bit of a problem. When we come to the movies list component, you'll notice that all of the data is hard-coded directly into this component. And that's not how we want to have everything set up. In fact, what we'd like to be able to do is to have a service that's specifically tailored for handling data. So let's go up and switch out our code a little bit and talk about how things have changed once we've implemented the service. Now, the first thing that I'd like to look at is an interface that's implemented in order to give a contract to the shape or the form or just a contract of the data. So here I've created an interface called iMovie. And so this says that all of the data that's movie data will have a name, it will have a genre, and also an image URL. Now, this is important because what we want to be able to do is use this interface in a number of different places within the application. And by having this available to us, we have IntelliSense support, and the application will tell us if our data does not adhere to the interface and give us breaking changes before we deploy the site, before we go online. We get really early detection of when something may have gone wrong. So that's been created and added into movie.interface.ts. Then the next thing that we'll do is have a service, and that's movies.service.ts. So this is the movie service, and there's a couple of interesting things going on here. So first of all, that you'll notice all of the data, instead of being put into the component itself, is now available here within the service. Now, in real world type of context, obviously we would be accessing a database or a service or some other type of construct. And here I'm just trying to keep things simple by just providing a standard array. In fact, if we were contacting some sort of outside service, instead of returning a simple array, it would probably be a promise or maybe Angular observables. But again, I'm trying to keep this simple for you. So for right now, it's just a basic array. Now, it's not just an array of any type of data. Since we have that interface, now what I'm saying is that the array will be of type iMovie. So here we're contracting the data to say that it needs to adhere to the iMovie interface in order to be a part of this function. And actually, it's not a function, it's a method. It's a method called getAll. It's the only method here available in this movie service. And so that's implemented here. And so when you call it, you get back an array of iMovie instances. Now I get access to iMovie by importing it here from movie.interface. And then I'm also bringing in another import called injectable. Now this is another type of decorator function like component, which you've seen in some of the other examples. But what this does is it marks this service as being able to be injected into other components. Now, this kind of brings up the whole issue of dependency injection and inversion control and IOC containers and all of that. So if you haven't had an opportunity to learn about those, there's a ton of resources available on the web that discuss them. But I'll tell you very briefly, the way it works is that instead of, like I showed you before, having the component where the data is directly within the component, what we want to be able to do is to have a service like movie service and inject this into any other component. Now that's important because when we go to test other aspects of our application, we don't want to have a lot of dependencies that are difficult to work with. So here we can say that we have a movie service. We will inject that into another component. And we'll also be able to say that there's only going to be one instance of this movie service. That's valuable because now if we want to share state or do any other type of sharing among the service to other aspects of the application, that's all available because we're using an IOC container. So by adding in this injectable decorator, all of that's sort of set up for you automatically. You don't have to worry about it. All you need to do is say that this is injectable, and then later on in another component, actually do the injection. So now when it comes to injecting the service, when we go and look at the movies list component, you'll notice that all the data is gone. Now, there's a few other things that are set up in order to make the injection happen, and I'll show you each one of those now. So the first thing that we need to do is import movie service because we'll be using that. And then what we can do is create a constructor that takes a parameter of type movie service. Now, the way this works is that when Angular encounters a constructor like this, it'll look and see that movie service is set up as injectable. And so behind the scenes for this component, it will create a member variable called movie service and provide the instance of movie service that it has already created and inject it into the movies list component. Now you can see that I'm even using this item down here, this member variable that it created for me, so I can actually call out to movieservice.getAll in order to get the values from the service. Now, I'm using this ng-on-init event handler here, and that's available by importing it in up here from Angular core, and then I can tell the movies list component that it implements on-init. This hooks into the component lifecycle for Angular components. And I'm doing this for a specific reason, because inside the constructor, what we don't want to do is use that place to call any sort of methods, or certainly not to call out to an external service. What we want to be able to do is put that in a place where it's easy to debug. So here I'm using the event lifecycle of the component by saying that when this component initializes, then I can go out to the movie service, get all the data, and set that equal to the movies. And once that's done, then Angular will spend the rest of its time recognizing that that change has happened and then data bind the page and list out the movies like we've seen in the past. So that works really well, but one thing that we do need to know is that how is this movie service going to be tied in to this component? The application in and of itself needs to know a little more information about movie service. So when we come up to app component, you'll see that it's available through the providers array. Now, remember, like I said, we built a parent-child relationship between app component and all of the other components that we're building. So by providing here through the providers array, movie service, now any of the child components of app component can have an instance available of this service when it requests it through dependency injection. So I'm making it available high up the chain so that anything else down the line has access to that component. So now let's go ahead and take a look at the application again, and you'll notice that as expected, we really shouldn't see any visual change. However, if we come in here and then go to the movie service, and then what I'll do is just remove all the data. I'll save that off and give the application a chance to refresh itself. So it's loading. And now what we'll see here is that all the data is gone and there's no movies to display. So that kind of verifies the fact that we've moved all of the logic for handling the data off into the service itself. So I can return all that back, save it, and once again, give the application a chance to recognize the change. And now we have all of our data back because it's being pulled from the service itself. Okay, now that is all well and good, so let's go ahead and start adding in some more interactivity to the application, and we'll implement the pipe. So let's switch over to the pipe branch and see what's changed now that we've implemented that. So the first thing that you'll notice is that we've added a new file here called movies filter pipe, and this is responsible for doing all of the transformation of the data as it's being filtered. So we have the movies filter pipe as the component itself. And this implements an interface called pipe transform. Now, pipe transform says that you have to provide an implementation for a single method. And here this takes in two parameters, first value and arguments. Value is the list of movies. So as we take a look at the movies that are coming in, we can filter them or do something interesting with it. The arguments that are coming in is the data that's being typed into that text box. So inside of transform, what we'll do is take a look at the args and then switch it to lowercase to make sure that we're looking at everything as apples to apples, and then get the filter value. Once we have that, then we can take a look at the array and use the filter function off of the array. And so this is just an anonymous function that's run that runs a function inside that says is matched. So really what I'm doing here is taking a look at the value, and that's whether I'm talking about the name or the genre, converting that to lowercase and looking to see based off of index of if I have a match for the filter that I'm passing in. So if I have a match on name, or a match on genre. If either one of those provide a match, then that will return true and essentially filter the data for the source that will be passed up through the component chain. Now, in order to make this a pipe that is available, we have to give it a name. And so here we're importing in the pipe component decorator, or the pipe decorator function, I should say, and giving the pipe a name of movies filter. So once we have that available, then what we can do is go up to the list component and start making that available on up the chain. So here we are importing in the pipe filter, the movies filter pipe, and then making that available inside of the component decorator, saying that the pipes that are a part of this component are within this array. And so I add in movies filter pipe into that array. Now for the component itself, what I need to do is have a member for the filter text. So here I create this item here and just initialize it as an empty string, because this is what will bind to the UI in order to be able to have a place to store the data that's being entered in by the user. So as we go up to the HTML, you'll see how this has changed a little bit. So what's been added is this input element. And then down here, you'll notice that we create, or we encounter, a different type of syntax than what we've seen in the past. So you saw the property binding with the square brackets, and now we have something else here with parentheses. Now, again, if you think about standard JavaScript, if you're going to run a function, you call the function name and then open and close parentheses in order to run it, given there's no arguments. And so that's the same idea here, so that the way that you get information out of a component within Angular is through events, and the way that you get something into a component is through property binding. So in this case, what you're seeing here is this is two-way data binding through Angular 2. So the value is being set through the square brackets of filter text, and it's being published out by any changes through the notation of the parentheses. Now, ng model is still the property that we use in order to tie everything together. So here, ng model is set up and associated with filter text. So this gives us two-way data binding into our component through the member that I created here called filter text. Now, that is used over in the ng4 directive by saying that we're going to use the movies filter, and the arguments that's being passed into it is the filter text that comes from this input element. And remember, movies filter is available to this view because it came through the component in the pipes array, and that name that comes all the way down through it is because we gave it the name of movies filter through the pipe decorator function. So all of that flows through and ties together all the way up to the HTML by being able to pipe the data through that pipe and filtering out the text based off of what's been typed into this input element. So if we take a look at the application at this point, now we have a filter box, and of course I can filter by title. So if I come here and put in an X, I get a matrix, and so I made an axe murderer. And if I want to look at all of the comedies here, I can filter on comedy. Didn't have to go all the way. Well, it always helps if you spell it right, but we'll find all the comedies just by even CO, but still it's all the genre and the titles of everything that you need there. So this is great. We have some functionality working. So the next thing that we need to do is kind of make it look better and implement the movie card. Okay, for the card, let's switch branches over to the card itself, and you'll notice that there's some new files here. And let's start off by taking a look at the CSS. So this is just regular CSS that you would write in any other way. There's really not much different about it, except what's interesting is that you'll notice here that I have a rule for the header. Now, in normal circumstances, this would be a bit of a problem because any header that was on the page would end up getting this style. But since we're using Angular 2 style isolation, that actually is not a problem. But for the most part, all of the styles that you see here are just any other types of rules that you would write anywhere else. So now as we take a look at the HTML, this is essentially a cut and paste out of the list component directly into the template for our movie card component. Now this is valuable because now what we're doing is we're keeping all the styles, all the HTML, and all the logic for the movie card specifically within its own component. So now when we take a look at the movie card component, you'll see here, based off the decorator function here, we have a selector of movie-card. And then I have a template URL for the HTML, as well as style URLs, and this accepts an array. And so here I just point to the CSS file that I've already created, and this will associate these styles specifically with this component. Now, what this does is it creates a template for data. So as the application loops through, each movie will get all of these elements in order to build it up on the page. But in order to do that, we need to bring data into this component. And so now we have another decorator function called input. And you'll notice that it's imported here from Angular Core. So I'm marking this movie property here with the type of iMovie, and then it's marked as input using this decorator function. So what this says is that as the parent component is using it, it can pass in data to the movie card component. And then once that data is available, it can data bind against this HTML. So as we take a look at the movies list component, here, instead of having all the markup that you saw previously, we're just declaring movie-card, and then again doing property binding using the square brackets, and then passing in the instance of the movie from this loop up here. So let movie of movies, here movie points here. So this gets added into the movie property of the movie card component. And now what we're able to do is bind everything together using that type of a situation. Now we need to tell that the movies list component that we're using the movie card component. And so we do that by adding in to the directives array. So what I had to do was import in the movie card component. Once that was available, then I can add it into the directives array so that the view knows that when it encounters the selector for movie-card, it will associate it with the component because it's added into this array. Okay, so let's take a look at how the app looks now, and it looks much, much nicer. So we've got some styling going on, and it looks a lot closer to the end result. Now, let's talk about the style isolation for a moment. So again, let's go in and inspect the element of this item. And so you notice here, I have the header for A Few Good Men. Now, the styles that it's associating with it are here, but notice this extra attribute that's added here. This is how Angular 2 achieves style isolation, because in my style sheet, all I did was say that I wanted a header styled with these rules, but as it rendered out the page, it changed how the selectors worked as well as the CSS itself so that it generates this attribute, adds it to the element itself. So when I come up here, you can see ng content, blah, 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 all the way down. And so that exists here within the styles also so that they match. And so this is how it does style isolation in order to be able to add styles into your components, and they don't bleed out into other areas of your application. So as you add in styles up here in movie card component into style URLs, anything that you put into that array will be updated so that you have style isolation available. Okay, so we have one last bit that we need to implement, and that's the click capability. So let's switch branches one more time, and we'll take a look at how things change here. So you'll notice, just like we had input, now what we have is an output decorator function. So we need to be able to have a way for the component to say what it can take in and what it will put out. So here we created a selected event, and this is set up based off of declaring it as an event emitter of iMovie. So what we're saying is that as this event is raised, what will be associated with it in the event args is an instance of iMovie. So here I'm creating a new event emitter with iMovie. And so now I can create a method on my component called onClick. And so when onClick is called, then it'll raise the selected event and do that by calling the emit method and then passing in the movie, the instance of the movie that's been passed to the card. So when we go up to the HTML, the thing that's changed here is we've added in this syntax here saying that it's being bound to the click event. And we're doing that because, again, we have parentheses. So this gives you an idea that we're dealing with events here. So we're binding to the click event. When the click event is then raised, then it will call onClick on the movie card component. So when we click, we call onClick, goes down to the movie card component. Once click is called, then we raise the selected event and then pass in the movie that's been passed into this component. Now, when we go one step up to its parent, we're going to look at the movies list component. At that point, what we're going to do is take the movie that's been raised in that event and then set the movie name equal to selected. And that's a new property that I created right up here. It's just a string property. And then this is bound using data binding up into the view. So when the selected event fires, then we're able to take a look at the movie that's passed into it, take its name, and add it to selected. Now, the way all of this ties together is right here. So here we're looking at movie card, and we're saying that data that's coming out of it, it will raise the selected event. And once that's done, once that selected event is raised, then on the movies list component, we'll call a function called onSelected and pass in the event details. So once that happens, once onSelected is called, again, you come in and then selected property gets the value for movie name. And we can show the value of the selected property by data binding it right here. So now let's take a look at the application. And so I can click on each one of these cards, and then the data card, the movie card will handle the event saying that it's clicked, and then raise the event saying it's selected, and then the overall movies list component will handle that event and then give the value of the movie name to the property that's bound right here after this label. So that's your very quick introduction to Angular 2. Now let's go back to slideshow for a second. Now, if you want to have a chance to use any of the code that you've seen here, you can go to github.com, Craig Shoemaker, Angular 2 intro. Also, if you're interested in looking to see how Ignite UI works with Angular 2, you can go to our repository there, Ignite UI-Angular 2, and start working with the Angular 2 directives specifically for Ignite UI. All right, now let's look at some of the questions that have come in from this webinar. So, isn't the interface really a model? And I think what you're talking about here is the movies interface. And is this really a model? Well, yes, this is the data that we're modeling for the application. And I could have implemented this as a class, but there wasn't really any state or behavior that I needed to make available. So I just kept it lightweight and implemented this as an interface. So that seems to work well for this type of application. Again, if you need to add more to it, you could certainly create a class that implements the iMovie interface and then use that around your app. But here, just using an interface seemed to make sense. The next one is, why call the service from ng-on-init and not from the constructor? Well, I talked about that a little bit when we were encountering that area. And so let's see, we're looking for movies list component. So here, what happens is we're getting an instance of movie service from the inversion of control container, and it'll inject it into this component. What we don't want to do is call any functions or any methods during the constructor, because Angular is out and building everything up, and we can't really tap into what's happening during the time that this component is being constructed. So if there's an error that's raised during that time, that could be a problem. So instead of doing that, we're tapping into the component event lifecycle and doing it on initialization of the component rather at the time of construction. So it's just easier to maintain and easier to debug if you go through it on that route. The next one is there any other way to pass a parameter to the pipe? Well, the way that I'm setting everything up here, we take a look at the pipe for a moment. We're implementing the pipe transform interface. So here, this contracts that I have to provide an implementation for the transform method, and this gives me the incoming data as well as the arguments that are coming into it. So in implementing it this way, there's not really any other way. This ties the value that gets typed into the input box all the way down to the pipe, and so this is the way that you would want to deal with it with a setup like this. All right, well, what's the upgrade path for Angular 1 to Angular 2? Do you need to do a full rewrite? And can you do an incremental side-by-side approach? Okay, what's the upgrade path? I'll be doing an upcoming webinar on the upgrade path. If you go to the Angular site, there's a very lengthy and in-depth article about the upgrade path. And really the idea is no, you don't need to do a full rewrite. And in fact, what you can do is take certain aspects of your application and upgrade that into Angular 2, basically one piece at a time. There are some things that you can't quite do that with, like pipes and certain types of directives. But the idea is that they have a very strategic upgrade path that's available to you. So it allows you to keep parts of your application in Angular 1 as well as Angular 2 until you can get the entire thing upgraded. So it's kind of a process, and it's something you need to do some research on. But is there an upgrade path? Yes. Do you need to do a full rewrite? No. And can you do incremental side by side? Yes, you can do that. Why did you not build this to work with a real database or service? Well, the reason I do that is because I want you to be able to take this code, download it, and use it right away, and not have to worry about connecting to external services, which may go up or may go down, or have to spend a lengthy process setting up a database. I just want you to learn the basics of Angular 2. So I hard-coded the data, which obviously is not something that you would want to do in the real world. And I didn't even set it up to return promises or observables. It's just a basic array. So this is just meant as a way to get you started in learning the basics of Angular 2. Now, why use TypeScript rather than just regular JavaScript? That's a really good question. And if I come over here, let's take a look at this file here. So what I want to do is bring up the JavaScript file that's created from one of these components. And you can't see it within Visual Studio Code, which is the editor that I'm using, because I have it hidden inside the IDE. But what you'll notice here is that the JavaScript that it creates, and of course, any sort of code generation, what comes out of it is really tough to read. But number one, we don't want to have to write anything like this. And number two, a big key of it is the fact of, when we're looking at the movie card component, is this component decorator. So we want a really simple way to be able to say, this is the selector, this is the template, these are the styles. And by using TypeScript, you can set that up, and then the transpilation process will generate the code that's necessary in order to make this into actual executing JavaScript. So it cleans up your code. TypeScript gives you type safety, and the tooling for TypeScript is far superior to just regular JavaScript, simply because you have a strongly typed environment to work with. So TypeScript makes a lot of sense in this type of a context. What logic transforms the vertical list into a horizontal one? That's my magic style sheet rule. And so if you come down here, you can see that all I'm doing is, well, if we come back up to the HTML itself, so here I have a section, and that's a block level element, and I apply the inline class to it. And so all I'm doing is telling that element to display as inline, so that everything stacks together horizontally. So that one's pretty easy to take care of. The next one is, can you write a service to call async methods? Well, when you build a service, chances are what you're doing is you're going to be doing an AJAX call out to some other service that's available on the web, and that's inherently asynchronous. So yes, you have the full ability to write JavaScript, or in this case, TypeScript, in any way that you might be used to using in the past. So you can do async stuff with promises, observables, any of that. So that's all available to you when you build your services. Can I confirm that the service singleton is per logged in user, as in each user receives their own single instance? Well, that depends on how you build your service, I suppose. Once your service accesses a backend server, if it's not respecting sessions and everything goes into a single bucket basically, then it wouldn't be per logged in user. But as far as the JavaScript is concerned, as far as the inversion of control container works, that's just JavaScript executing within the browser. So that would be independent based off of each user's session. So it kind of depends on how the implementation is working. Is there ever a need for a base class? Well, sure. Yeah. And in fact, what you're finding with the single page applications is that a lot of the same design paradigms and patterns that we're used to seeing on the server are basically just being pushed up to the client. So as more logic is being needed to be implemented in the client, all of the same problems and all the same challenges that we have on the server are now right there in the client. So you very well could need to implement a base class, base component class, or a base model class for how you're modeling your domain logic in JavaScript in the browser. So yeah, you could definitely find situations where that would be necessary. I was just keeping things simple, so I didn't need to do that here. Angular 1 had factories, services, and on is Angular 2 just components? Basically, the short answer to that is yes. With Angular 1, I would even get lost trying to figure out, well, okay, does this need to be a factory or service, or should this be a value or a constant? And there's just a lot of confusing guidance, and the documentation was good but not great on how to lead you in the right direction. But the idea for Angular 2 is that things have been simplified. We're mostly just dealing with components and services and a handful of entities, basically. And so, yeah, a lot of that confusion should go away. Learning Angular 2 is quite a bit more simple in that regard as opposed to Angular 1. So let's return now to the slide where you can get all the code. So again, thank you so much for joining me during this webinar today. This is Craig Shoemaker, and I hope to talk to you again real soon.